What happens when a crime is so horrific that it leaves a permanent scar on the justice system itself? The Derby case of 2012 didn't just end lives. It destroyed the psychological armor of the men and women sworn to solve it. We're uncovering why this case remains their greatest burden. Jade was 10 years old. She liked school on most days. She had her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn jaw. And she wore both features with the unconscious confidence of a child who has not yet learned to question her own reflection. On the night of the 10th of May, 2012, she went to bed the same way she had gone to bed every other night of her short life, surrounded by the noise of siblings. Wrapped in the particular chaos that only a large family can produce, she pulled whatever cover was available over herself, found her corner of the room, and she slept. Duane was 8, John was 7, Jack was 6, Jesse was 5, and Jaden, his twin, his mirror, the boy who had shared every breath of his existence from the very beginning, was 5 as well. 6 children, 1 house, 1 night. Not one of them would see the morning. Take a moment with those words. Do not let them move through you too quickly. 6 children went to sleep inside a terraced house on a quiet street in Derby, England, and not one of them opened their eyes to the following day. Jade, Duane, John, Jack, Jesse, Jaden. Their names deserve to be spoken in full and spoken slowly, because the world moved far too fast for them. It held its investigations, its courtrooms, its verdicts, its newspaper columns, and somewhere deep inside all of that noise, the children themselves became secondary to the spectacle surrounding them. This channel will not allow that, not tonight. Here is something that most people would rather not say out loud. The most dangerous place a child can exist is not a war zone, not a dark alley, not the car of a stranger. For too many children, in too many places, the most dangerous space they will ever occupy is the home they were born into. The place with the familiar smell and the known voices and the particular quality of morning light they have never once had to think about, because it has simply always been there. We do not like to hold that thought for long. It unsettles something deep in us, something we would prefer to leave undisturbed. But this story asks you to disturb it. Let me ask you something before we go any further. Think about the street where you live. Think about the house 3 doors down, or the flat above the corner shop, or the neighbors whose first names you barely know from the occasional nod across the fence. Do you know what happens inside those walls at 2 in the morning? Do you know what the children in those homes hear when the front door closes, when the curtains are drawn, when the outside world has quietly decided that everything looks fine? Because from the outside, the house on Victory Road in Allenton looked exactly like every other house on that street. Unremarkable, ordinary, invisible in the way that working-class streets in mid-size English cities are designed to be. Functional, forgettable, entirely without alarm. What happened inside that house was not an accident. It was not a faulty wire or a forgotten flame. It was not the kind of terrible random catastrophe that we instinctively reach for because the truth is harder to carry. What happened on the night of the 10th of May, 2012, was a decision, a deliberate, considered, coldly constructed decision, made by someone who looked at 6 sleeping children and chose. That is the story you are about to hear. Before we go any further, if you believe that stories like this one need to be told, and they do, take 5 seconds right now, hit the like button, subscribe to Bedtime Black File Story, and turn on your notifications so you never miss another case. This channel exists so that the people the world moves on from are never truly left behind. The very least we can do for Jade, Duane, John, Jack, Jesse, and Jaden is make sure their story is heard by every person it needs to reach. Stay with me. We are only at the beginning. Allenton is not the kind of place that appears on travel lists or comes up in conversations about the better parts of Derby. It sits roughly 120 miles northwest of London, pressed into the southern edge of a city that was built on industry and has spent the better part of 4 decades adjusting to the fact that much of that industry is gone. What remains is a suburb of terraced council houses, corner shops with metal shutters, and streets where the same families have occupied the same addresses across 2 and 3 generations. Because the kind of mobility that requires financial stability has always been just beyond their reach. People get up here, go to work, come home, manage their lives within narrow margins, and largely do not stop to examine the landscape they are living in. They are simply inside it. Victory Road sits within this world without distinction. It is a street of red brick terraces, each one pressed flush against the next. Architecture designed to house large numbers of people within a small footprint, doing exactly that without apology for decades. The houses are narrow, with small front gardens that range from reasonably tidy to quietly neglected, depending on who lives inside, and shallow paths leading to front doors that open almost directly onto the pavement. In warmer months, the children spill out of the houses, and the street becomes a loose extension of every front room behind it. In winter, curtains stay drawn and the entire block settles into a grey, compressed quiet. The particular mood of English working-class housing when the cold has closed everything down. The Philpott house was number 18. From the outside, it looked precisely as it was meant to. Unremarkable. 3 bedrooms, a small kitchen, a front room that served as the household's primary gathering space, and far less square footage than their size clearly required. The paint on the exterior had begun to peel at the edges, not dramatically, but in the gradual, unhurried way of a surface that has not been attended to in some time, and is unlikely to be soon. The front garden was functional and nothing more, a strip of concrete and patchy scrub that the children passed through twice a day without once registering it. What was not visible from the street was the converted garage running along the side of the property. At some point, it had been repurposed, not officially, not with any structural improvement, but with the bare practicality of a household that needed more sleeping space than the bedrooms could supply. The conversion was basic: a mattress or 2, thin walls between the space and the rest of the house, minimal ventilation, and a layout that had never once been considered in terms of fire safety. Some of the Philpott children slept there regularly, not because anyone thought it ideal, but because it existed. And in a household managing the daily needs of 6 children on a budget stretched to its limit, available space does not get evaluated. It gets used. No one passing by would have known. From the street, there was nothing to see. The walls of the house were thin, as council terrace housing tends to be. Thin enough that sound passed between properties with very little resistance. The neighbors on either side had absorbed this as one of the unremarkable facts of living on that stretch of road. They could recall the sounds of the Philpott household, children's voices at various volumes, the television running through the evenings, adult voices raised on some nights more than others, and the general sustained noise of a large family occupying a small space. None of them described what they heard as alarming. A loud household on a busy street is not cause for concern. It is just background. It registers and is set aside, because that is what background does. The school run happens every morning. The children left the house in the way children always do when they are young and perpetually behind schedule, half-dressed, mid-argument, moving fast enough to suggest urgency without ever quite achieving it. They walked to their primary school, returned in the afternoons, and the pattern repeated the next day and the day after that without variation. Neighbors saw them go and come back. Teachers knew their faces. The nearby shops recognized them as regulars. The Philpott children were part of the daily rhythm of that part of Derby, the way children in working-class neighborhoods always are. Visible, familiar, and completely taken for granted. That is the detail that is hardest to sit with, not the violence itself. The ordinary net, the school runs, the thin walls, the peeling paint, the converted garage where children went to sleep. The most devastating things do not announce themselves. To understand what happened on Victory Road, you first have to understand who lived there, not as a collection of names attached to a case file, not as a family reduced to their worst moments or their final hours, but as people, specific, complicated, fully formed human beings who occupied that house with all the noise and weight that real lives carry. So that is where we begin. Mick Philpott was born in 1965 in Derby. He grew up in the same city he would never truly leave, in the same working-class world that Victory Road represented. And from an early age, he distinguished himself in one clear way. He could play football, genuinely play it. Not at a backyard level, but at a level that earned him a place on the books at Derby County, one of the most storied football clubs in the English Midlands. For a young man from Allenton, that was not a small thing. That was a door opening onto a version of life that most of his peers would never see. For a brief, charged period, Mick Philpott was someone who appeared to be going somewhere. The door closed. It closed without drama, without a single catastrophic event, but with the quiet and grinding disappointment of a career that simply never materialized at the level it had promised. He transitioned into non-league football, then into a rotating sequence of manual jobs, then into the particular posture of a man who has had to find a different way to be important. What replaced the football career was something harder to name but easy to recognize, a need to dominate every room he entered, to be heard when he spoke, to be deferred to when decisions were made. He was physically imposing, socially loud, and capable of considerable charm when charm served his purposes. People found him magnetic, sometimes, exhausting, often frightening. Eventually, Narrated came from a different mold entirely. Her background was Irish Catholic, her upbringing quieter and more structured than Mick's. Her disposition measured where his was explosive. She met Mick when she was a teenager, and by the late 1980s their relationship had produced their first child together. She was, in almost every observable sense, the emotional counterweight to everything Mick was. Patient where he was volatile, understated where he performed, contained where he expanded to fill whatever space he occupied. Those who knew the couple in their early years sometimes described her as steady and warm. What is harder to determine, looking back, is at what point steadiness became compliance, and warmth became a survival mechanism. Myra did not work outside the home during the years leading up to May 2012. She managed the household, managed the children, and managed the daily labor of keeping a large family functional on limited resources. She was the one who knew which child needed what medication, which school had which event on which day, and whose shoes had worn through at the sole again. In the architecture of that house, she was the load-bearing wall, less visible than the structure around her, but without her, nothing stood. Then there were the children. Jade was the eldest at 10, and she carried that position with the particular seriousness of a firstborn, who has learned that being the oldest means being expected to set an example even when no one has quite explained what example that is. She was sharp-minded and quietly observant, the kind of child whose teachers noted in reports that she engaged thoughtfully when she chose to, when the disruptions at home allowed her to settle enough to choose. She had her own opinions, her own preferences, her own emerging sense of who she was going to be. Duane was 8, and considerably less interested in setting any example for anyone. He was energetic and competitive, the kind of boy who turned everything into a contest, and whose laugh, neighbors recalled, was disproportionately large for his size. He played roughly and recovered quickly, and had his mother's ability to read a room, even if he rarely acted on what he read. John was 7, quieter than Duane, quicker to find a corner and occupy it without demanding attention. He was the middle child in the truest sense, not invisible, but practiced at not requiring the spotlight, content in a way that his siblings, louder and more insistent, sometimes were not. Jack was 6. He was at the age where the world is still primarily a physical experience. Things to climb, things to throw, things to dismantle and examine and occasionally break. His teachers described him as enthusiastic with energy to spare, which is the diplomatic language schools use for a child who will not stop moving and has not yet been given enough space to do it productively. Jesse was 5. He was one of the twins, which meant that he had never once experienced the concept of being alone in the way that his older siblings had. From his first moment of awareness, there had always been Jaden, present, parallel, essentially indistinguishable to people who did not know them well, entirely distinct to everyone who did. Jesse was slightly the bolder of the two, the one who moved first and checked afterward, who initiated and expected his brother to follow. Jaden was 5. He was the one who followed, but not passively, with the particular confidence of a child who knows that wherever he goes, someone who understands him completely will be just behind him. The twins existed in their own vocabulary, their own shorthand, their own closed loop of communication that functioned independently of the household around them. They shared a room, shared clothes, shared the converted space at the side of the house, and shared the absolute, unquestioned certainty that they would always be together. They were not remarkable children in the way that obituaries sometimes reach for remarkable. They were ordinary in all the ways that matter most. Curious, loud, growing, full of the uncomplicated forward motion of young lives that have not yet encountered anything they cannot absorb. They were not defined by what would happen to them. They were defined by who they already were, and who they were deserves to be held before we say anything else. What the children deserved and what the children lived were not always the same thing. That gap between who those 6 young people were and what the environment surrounding them actually required of them is where this story begins to darken. Not suddenly, not with a single moment of revelation, but with the slow accumulating pressure of a household whose warmth existed in the spaces Mick Philpott permitted and contracted the moment he withdrew that permission. Mick's need for control was not occasional. It was not a temper that flared under stress and settled in calmer times. It was structural, the way he organized every relationship inside that house, every interaction with the outside world, every decision made about the children's schooling, their movements, their daily rhythms. He decided what the household looked like to the people around it. He decided what version of Mick Philpott the neighbors, the schools, and the authorities were allowed to see. And he had, over years of practice, become exceptionally skilled at maintaining the distance between that version and the one that existed behind the front door. He had a criminal record that most people in his circle either did not know about or had absorbed into the broader narrative of a man who was simply difficult. He had previously been convicted of assaulting a former partner, a fact that, placed beside everything else that would eventually surface, was not an anomaly, but a pattern. A man who raises his hand once and faces no serious consequence does not typically conclude that he was wrong. He concludes that he was not sufficiently careful. The behavior does not stop, it adapts. My read understood this in the particular unspoken way that people who live inside controlled environments always understand it, not through analysis, but through the body, through the slight recalibration that happens when a certain tone enters a voice, through knowing which conversations to start and which to allow to die quietly before they became something else. She was financially dependent on Mick in the complete sense of the word. She had not held employment outside the home throughout the years that mattered most, and the income that sustained the household flowed through him, which meant that the power flowed through him too. Financial dependence is not simply about money. It is about the daily compounding reality that the person who controls the resources controls the choices, and when the choices are controlled, what remains is compliance dressed up as agreement. She was also isolated in ways that are easy to overlook when a person is surrounded by people. A house full of 6 children is loud and relentlessly social in the narrow sense. There is always someone present, always something happening, always a need to be met. But community is not the same as company, and Mared's world had contracted over the years into the house, the children, and Mick. The friendships that might have existed outside his orbit had been quietly redirected. The family members who might have offered perspective had been rendered peripheral. She was, by the time of May 2012, a woman whose entire existence had been shaped around accommodating one person's requirements, and that is not a situation that produces clear thinking or independent action. Mick's relationship with the children followed the same architecture. He was capable of warmth toward them. This is important to understand, because people who do only harm are easier to comprehend than people who do harm alongside genuine feeling. There were moments of real fathering, the rough play, the attendance at school events, the loud pride in their achievements when it reflected well on him. But underneath those moments was a consistent, calculating assessment of what the children represented in practical terms. In Mick's world, children were not simply children. They were present, they were overweight, they were leveraged in arguments with schools, with social services, with former partners, with the council, with anyone who questioned his version of himself as a man doing right by his family. This calculation extended across a remarkable number of lives. By the time the Philpott case came to national attention, it would emerge that Mick had fathered at least 17 children across multiple relationships over the course of his adult life. 17. That number, when it surfaced, produced a particular quality of public reaction. Part disbelief, part something darker, part a slowly dawning recognition that this was not the consequence of recklessness or passion, but of a man who had understood, with cold precision, that children produced within the right circumstances generated things: attention, sympathy, housing consideration, and the appearance of a family life substantial enough to deflect scrutiny. Paternal love, for Mick Philpott, was always adjacent to utility. It is within this dynamic, the controlled household, the dependent partner, the children held as much as assets as they were held as people, that a third presence becomes relevant. A woman who had once lived inside this same structure and had made the decision to leave it. A woman whose departure Mick had never once accepted as legitimate, whose continued existence outside his control had become, over time, the thing he resented most in the world. Her name was Lisa Willis, and the moment she walked away from Mick Philpott was the moment the clock, though no one knew it yet, began to move. There is a specific kind of person who experiences the departure of another not as loss, but as theft, for whom a door closing quietly on someone else's terms reads not as a legitimate ending, but as an act of aggression that demands a response. This person does not grieve what has gone. They calculate what must follow. Everything that is about to unfold on Victory Road begins with that calculation, and with the woman whose decision to leave forced Mick Philpott to make it. Lisa Willis had not arrived in the Philpott world as an outsider. She had existed within it across a stretch of years as a fixed and acknowledged presence, a third adult in a domestic arrangement that the people inside it navigated in their own way, and that the world outside it largely chose not to examine with any sustained attention. Mick was at the center of that arrangement, as Mick was at the center of every arrangement he inhabited. Both Lisa and Myreed occupied positions that curved around his requirements, his moods, his preferences, and his carefully maintained sense of himself as the indispensable figure at the heart of every dynamic he created. Whether Lisa's continued presence within that arrangement represented anything like a free choice, or whether it was the product of the slow, accumulated weight that living inside a controlling environment places on a person's ability to see alternatives clearly is not a question with a single clean answer. What is certain is that the arrangement existed, that it persisted, and that when it ended, the ending was not mutual. During the years she spent within the Philpott household, Lisa bore Mick 2 children, Shannon and Leanne. They were part of his wider structure of relationships, included in the household because he had sanctioned their inclusion, present in the way that everything in Mick's orbit was present, functional, accounted for, serving a role within the larger picture he was constructing of himself as a man with a family, with dependence, with weight in the world. And Lisa stayed within this picture for longer than might be easily understood from the outside. She stayed through the volatility, through control, through the daily reality of existing as a secondary figure in a space organized entirely around one man's primacy. And then she reached the point that people inside situations built on that kind of imbalance sometimes reach, where the cost of remaining finally becomes legible in a way it had not been before. And she made her decision. She left, and she did not leave quietly. Lisa Willis filed formal complaints. She raised documented concerns with social services regarding the welfare of children in Mick's care. She spoke to the police. She made her objections part of the official record, and she kept making them. Not as an exercise in bitterness, but because she had been inside that house and she understood the distance between the version of Mick Philpott that authorities tended to encounter and the version that existed when no official attention was present. She had watched that gap operate across years of close proximity, and she believed with the clarity of someone who had lived the experience, rather than read about it, that the children who remained under his care needed someone willing to say out loud what she was saying. Now pause here for a moment, because what happened next matters in a way that extends beyond this case and this street and this particular family. There are people who, when they lose control over another person, do not process that loss as a normal human being processes loss. They do not adjust, they do not reflect, they do not accept that another person's decision to leave was that person's legitimate right. Instead, they mobilize, they redirect every social and relational resource available to them toward ensuring that the person who left understands that departure carries consequences. Have you ever watched this happen? Have you ever seen someone face sustained, deliberate retaliation? Not for doing anything wrong, but specifically for telling the truth about something another person needed to remain hidden, because that is the precise situation Lisa Willis entered the moment her complaints became formal. Mick's response was not a legal challenge. It was not a reflection. It was a campaign of narrative replacement, conducted loudly and persistently across every social space he occupied. In his version of events, Lisa was not a woman with legitimate concerns about the safety of children. She was a vindictive former partner, weaponizing the language of child welfare to damage a devoted father who had done nothing to deserve the scrutiny she was generating. He told this to friends. He told his neighbors. He told it to anyone whose attention he could hold, because he understood instinctively that the more people who heard his version, the less room existed for hers to breathe. The difficulty, for Mick, was that Lisa did not stop. She had made a decision of considerable personal cost, and she held to it, which meant that official attention, welfare checks, social services visits, police inquiries, continued to arrive at intervals he could manage but not eliminate. And Shannon and Leanne remained in Lisa's care, not under his roof, subject to legal and institutional processes that operated according to their own logic, rather than his. By the time this dynamic had been running long enough to settle into a pattern, the anger Mick carried had changed in quality. It had moved from the hot, demonstrative fury that makes noise in the short term into something considerably quieter and more purposeful. He was no longer simply enraged that Lisa had left. He was thinking in the focused and patient way of a man who has decided that a problem of this scale requires a solution of equivalent scale, about what that solution might look like. That shift from fury to focus was the most dangerous thing that had yet happened in this story. Custody disputes are, in their ordinary form, among the most painful legal processes that exist. They place children at the center of adult conflict and require institutions, courts, social workers, legal representatives to make determinations about family life based on evidence that is almost always partial, filtered through competing perspectives, and shaped by the self-interest of every adult involved. In their ordinary form, they are exhausting and damaging for everyone concerned. What Mick Philpott constructed around the question of Shannon and Leanne was not a custody dispute in any ordinary form. It was a campaign. The central objective of that campaign was straightforward: establish Lisa Willis as an unfit and malicious actor, and establish Mick as the wronged party. The devoted father denied access to his children by a woman whose motivations were personal rather than parental. This was not a position arrived at through honest assessment. It was a strategy, and it was deployed with the particular energy of a man for whom image management had become second nature over the course of a lifetime spent maintaining the gap between his public presentation and his private reality. Mick and Myra told friends that Lisa was unstable. They told neighbors that she was vindictive. They told anyone who would listen that she was not raising child welfare concerns out of genuine care, but out of jealousy, out of the desire to interfere with the family she had removed herself from, out of a wish to damage a man she could not control. The word they returned to most frequently was malicious. She was malicious. Her complaints were malicious. Her continued involvement in the lives of Shannon and Leanne was an act of malice dressed up as motherhood. The problem with this framing was that the people it needed to convince most, the social workers, the police officers, the legal representatives operating within the custody process, were not as easily managed as a neighbor over a garden fence. They had access to records. They had professional frameworks for assessing the credibility of competing claims. They conducted visits, asked questions, and produced reports that existed independently of what Mick said about Lisa, or what Lisa said about Mick. And the picture those reports collectively built across the months and years of inquiry into the Philpott household was one that should, in a functioning system, have produced more decisive intervention than it did. Social services had been inside the Victory Roadhouse. They had spoken to the children, observed the environment, and noted the overcrowding, the instability, and the particular quality of tension that large families under significant stress tend to generate. Police had responded to incidents involving the Philpott household and had records of those responses. Schools had observed the children closely enough to note that their home circumstances affected their ability to settle and learn. The institutional infrastructure for identifying a family in difficulty was present and had been engaged. The difficulty was that engagement had not produced protection. Mick was, when he needed to be, extraordinarily effective at managing official attention. He had spent enough time in contact with various agencies, through the sheer scale of his family and the disputes surrounding it, to understand how assessments were conducted, what language tended to produce concern, and what language tended to reassure, and how to present himself as a cooperative and transparent parent rather than a resistant one. He was physically imposing but verbally fluent when fluency served him. He could walk into a social services visit and fill the room with the energy of a man who had nothing to hide, and then walk out having given the visiting officer a performance rather than a reality. What he could not fully control was Lisa. She was outside his immediate sphere. She was filing her own accounts with her own details, and those accounts were being received and recorded by people he had no direct access to. She had left, and in leaving she had acquired a kind of independence from his management that no amount of counter-narrative could entirely neutralize. This was the central structural problem of the custody dispute, as Mick experienced it. The official processes were not simply responding to him, they were responding to both parties. And Lisa had standing that his campaign could diminish, but not destroy. The legal dimensions of the custody arrangement were playing out slowly, as such processes always do, moving through the machinery of family courts and welfare assessments, and the accumulated paperwork of two adults with genuinely competing claims on the lives of two children. Mick pushed for more access to Shannon and Leanne. Lisa maintained her position. The institutions moved at institutional speed, which is to say not quickly, and not decisively, and not in a way that resolved anything cleanly for either party. For most people, this is where the story of a contested custody arrangement stays. Frustrating, damaging, prolonged, but contained within legal and social structures that, for all their inadequacy, represent the boundary between conflict and catastrophe. For Mick Philpott, the legal process was becoming a boundary he was less and less willing to accept as the limit of his options. The custody dispute was not going the way he wanted it to go. Lisa remained a presence he could not eliminate through narrative alone, and the household he was running, crowded, under scrutiny, financially precarious, was not producing the life he believed he was owed. He had spent months talking about the problem. He was about to start thinking about the solution. There are two ways to understand what Mick Philpott wanted from the destruction of his own household. The first is emotional, the rage of a man who had been challenged, contradicted, and defied by Lisa Willis, and who had decided that a response proportionate to what he felt she had done to him needed to be found. The second is coldly material, and in some ways it is more disturbing than the first, because it suggests that the violence that followed was not only born from passion, but from arithmetic. Mick Philpott did not just want revenge, he wanted a better house. The family home at Victory Road had been formally assessed by the council as overcrowded for a household of their size. This was not a contested point. 6 children, 2 adults, and a converted garage pressed into service as sleeping space was not a living arrangement that any housing standard in the United Kingdom would have considered adequate. Mick had raised this with the local council on multiple occasions. He had made the argument, not without basis in fact, that the family needed more space, a larger property, something that could reasonably contain the number of people living within it. The council had been slow to respond. The waiting list for larger council properties in that part of Derby was long, and the allocation process moved according to its own criteria and its own timeline, neither of which Mick had any ability to accelerate. What Mick understood about the housing system, and about the benefit system more broadly, was that it responded to need as it could be demonstrated at the point of assessment. A family with 6 children in an overcrowded house had a documented need for more space, but that need was weighed against other needs, processed through a queue, and satisfied at whatever pace the system determined appropriate. It did not respond to impatience. It did not respond to pressure. It responded to evidence. And the evidence it found most compelling was the kind that created an emergency rather than a chronic problem. A family that had lost children, a house that had burned, a grieving father suddenly rehoused from a property that no longer existed, with fewer dependents than before. That was not a family waiting in a queue. That was a priority case. This calculation did not come from nowhere. Mick had spent years treating the systems around him, welfare, housing, social services, not as support structures but as instruments to be read, navigated, and, where possible, directed toward outcomes that served his interests. He was not the first person to approach the benefit system with a transactional mindset, and the system itself bears some responsibility for creating conditions in which that mindset can flourish. But Mick's relationship with these systems had a particular quality. He was not simply claiming what he was entitled to. He was actively modeling the conditions that would generate the largest possible return. Children meant benefits. More children meant more benefits. A larger family meant a stronger housing claim. Every dependent in that house had a financial value within the system he was operating in, and he understood that value with a precision that most people would find uncomfortable to contemplate. The irony, and it is a terrible irony, is that the children he was willing to sacrifice for a larger property were themselves the very source of the housing argument he was making. A family of 8 needed more space. A grieving father of 2 surviving children, living in the wreckage of a council house, needed emergency rehousing. The mathematics of his plan required the deaths to generate the outcome, which means that the children's value to him, in the final calculation he made, was greater as an argument in death than as a family in life. The custody dispute with Lisa added a second layer to this arithmetic. If the fire could be made to look like the result of Lisa's interference, if the blame could be placed at her door convincingly enough, then Mick would accomplish something beyond improved housing and the resolution of a financial dispute. He would destroy the credibility of the woman who had spent months filing complaints against him. He would transform her from a concerned former partner with documented concerns into a suspect, a woman whose obsession with a family that had moved on from her had produced a catastrophic and criminal result. Every complaint she had ever filed would be reread through the lens of motive. Every word she had said to social services would become evidence of an unstable woman capable of extreme harm. He would win completely and on every front. Lisa discredited, housing secured. The custody battle ended not by a court's decision, but by circumstance so devastating that no further legal process would be necessary, and himself positioned, critically, centrally, as the victim of it all. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something directly. If you have stayed with this story this far, if you have sat with the names of 6 children and the slow, deliberate construction of a plan that treated their lives as line items in a personal ledger, leave a comment below. Tell me what you are feeling right now, because the weight of this story deserves to be shared, not carried alone. And if there is someone in your life who you think needs to hear this, who needs to understand what domestic control can become when it is left unchecked, share this video with them. It is a harder watch than most. That is precisely why it matters. The most revealing thing about the months that preceded the fire on Victory Road is not that Mick Philpott formed a plan. It is that he talked about it, not in whispers, not in the guarded, coded language of a person conscious of the risk they are taking by speaking. He talked about it the way he talked about everything, at volume, with confidence, in the company of people who knew him well enough to have learned that the shocking thing he had just said was usually best received with a laugh and a subject change. In the period leading up to the 10th of May, 2012, Mick spoke on multiple occasions, to multiple people, about the idea of a fire. He described how easy it would be to start one. He talked about what it would look like if it appeared to be an accident. He discussed, in terms that should have been reported immediately by every person who heard them and were not, how such an event could be framed in a way that directed suspicion toward Lisa Willis. He said these things, according to witnesses who would later give testimony in court, with the casual energy of a man running through a hypothetical rather than a man describing a decision he had already effectively made. He smiled when he said them. He moved on when the conversation naturally shifted. He did not circle back with visible urgency or betray in any external way that he was doing anything other than entertaining a dark idea for the reaction it would generate. This is one of the most psychologically instructive dimensions of this entire case, and it is worth spending real time with. When a person says something monstrous with a smile attached to it, in a social setting, surrounded by people who have known them for years, the people hearing it are faced with a choice between 2 interpretations. The first is that the person means what they have said, in which case everyone present has an obligation to act, and the situation becomes immediately serious, uncomfortable, and demanding. The second is that the person does not mean it, that they are performing darkness for effect, that this is the kind of thing this particular person says, that the appropriate response is a wary laugh and a subject change. The second interpretation is almost always chosen, because it is the one that costs the people in the room nothing. It requires no confrontation, no difficult conversation, no involvement in something that then becomes their responsibility to carry. Every person who heard Mick Philpott describe the outline of what he planned to do to his house and his children chose the second interpretation. Not one of them went to the police. Not one of them sat with what they had heard long enough to let it become something other than dark humor from a man known for saying outrageous things. They absorbed it, set it aside, and moved on. In doing so, they gave Mick something he could not have manufactured on his own: the protection of collective disbelief. Narrated was not outside this conversation. She was by this point sufficiently embedded in the architecture of Mick's thinking that she had heard his discussions about the fire and had not taken them to anyone. Her precise degree of active involvement in the planning has been the subject of intense scrutiny, legal argument, and public debate. What is established is that she was aware. She had heard enough to know that what Mick was describing was not abstract. She shared his resentment toward Lisa, shared the financial stress of the overcrowded house, and shared, at some level, the sense that the custody dispute needed resolution, that the legal process was not delivering at the pace either of them wanted. Whether she believed the plan would actually be carried out, or whether she had found the same protective disbelief that his friends had found, is a question the jury at Nottingham Crown Court would eventually be required to answer. What is clear is that as the weeks and months of these conversations accumulated, the hypothetical was becoming something more structured. Mick was not simply thinking aloud anymore. He was, in the language that prosecutors would later use with considerable effect, rehearsing. He was road testing the narrative he intended to deploy in the aftermath. The grieving father, the suspicious ex-partner, the tragic accident that had befallen a family already under strain. He was checking whether the story held up when he said it out loud, gauging how people received it, filing away the responses that suggested it could work. By early May 2012, the conversations had stopped expanding. They had contracted into something smaller and more specific. The timeline had closed around a date. The details had been walked through enough times that they no longer needed discussion. The plan had crossed the boundary between an idea that was spoken about and an intention that was being quietly prepared for. The children were still going to school. Jade was still the eldest, still carrying the weight of that position. Duane was still too loud and too fast. John was still finding his corner. Jack was still pulling apart everything he could reach. Jesse and Jaden were still moving through the world in their inseparable parallel way, each one the other's fixed point in an environment that had never been quite as stable as it should have been. They did not know what was coming. They had no reason to. The night of the 10th of May was 8 days away. The 10th of May arrived without announcement. It came the way all days come on working-class streets in English industrial cities, with a grey morning that brightened slightly toward noon, a school run completed in the usual scramble, an afternoon that dissolved into the domestic machinery of early evening. Victory Road looked exactly as it always looked at the start of a weeknight. The light dropped slowly over the red brick terraces, a long fade rather than a sharp cut to dark. Somewhere up the street, a door closed. The smell of cooking moved through open windows. A television ran through a thin wall. Nothing about the surface of that evening carried any indication of what was being prepared inside number 18. Inside the house, the children moved through the familiar motions of a night at home. The television was on. It was almost always on, the background noise against which life on Victory Road was conducted, and some of the younger children sat in front of it with the complete, uncomplicated absorption that children of 5 and 6 give to a screen when nothing is demanding their attention elsewhere. Jade, at 10, was the eldest, and being the eldest in a house of 6 children carries its own weight, a loose, unassigned vigilance. an awareness of mood and atmosphere that the younger ones have not yet developed. Duane moved through whatever competition or argument was running between the children that evening, because there was always one. John found his corner. Jack burned through energy in the physical, relentless way of a 6-year-old who has not yet encountered a surface he could not climb, or an object he could not dismantle. Jesse and Jaden occupied the world together, as they always had, parallel and inseparable, each one the other's reference point in any room they entered. They were put to bed as the evening drew on. Putting 6 children to bed in a house that cannot comfortably accommodate 6 children is never a quiet process. It runs through resistance and negotiation, and the enforcement of rules that the children know by rote, and it arrives at a tired, partial silence as the household's energy decreases one child at a time. The lights in the upper rooms went off. The converted garage, where some of the children slept, went dark. A neighbor standing outside that hour would have watched the house and seen nothing unusual. Windows going black in the ordinary sequence of a family winding down for the night. What that neighbor could not have seen was what was happening inside once the children were still. The prosecution's account of the events that followed is precise in its outline and devastating in its implications. At some point during the night, petrol was introduced into the ground floor of the house. It was not introduced carelessly or randomly. It was concentrated, applied with deliberate attention to location, directed toward the areas of the house where the children were sleeping, where the converted garage connected to the main structure, where the layout of the building would ensure that fire, once started, would have maximum effect in minimum time. The accelerant was placed where the children were. That is not a characteristic of an accident. That is a characteristic of intention. Council housing of the type built on Victory Road was constructed for density and affordability, not for fire containment. The walls were thin. The materials used throughout the structure were not designed to slow a blaze. They housed people economically, and they did so without incident in the ordinary run of circumstances. In the presence of an accelerant poured at strategic points across the ground floor, the same building became a space where fire had almost no natural obstacles, where it could move from the point of ignition through the lower floor, up through the structure, and into the sleeping spaces of both the main house and the converted garage with a speed that no person waking inside it could outrun. The converted garage was the most exposed point in the structure. It had not been built as a living space. Its conversion to sleeping quarters had been driven by necessity, and necessity had not asked questions about emergency egress. The garage had limited exits. Its windows were small. The door connecting it to the rest of the house was not a fire door. When the fire reached it, that door became part of the mechanism rather than any part of an escape route. The fire moved with exactly the speed that the petrol and the building materials and the layout of the structure dictated it would. It moved faster than the age of the people inside it could accommodate. It moved faster than the awareness that comes from being woken by smoke in a dark room allows for. It moved without pause and without mercy and without any regard for the fact that the people in its path were children. Mick and Mariette were not inside the house when the fire began. That single established fact, confirmed through the investigation that followed, is where the line between accident and crime becomes impossible to stand on either side of. A house burns. 6 children are inside it. The 2 adults responsible for those children are not. Those facts do not arrange themselves into any configuration that the word accident can contain. The clock that had begun to move, silently and without announcement, the moment Lisa Willis walked away from this household, had finally reached the end of its count. The neighbor who called the emergency services did so because smoke was visible from the street. By the time that call was made, the fire had already been burning long enough to have made its decisions about the interior of the house on Victory Road, and those decisions were final. What follows is not comfortable. It is not designed to be. The temptation in stories of this kind is to pull back at the moment the story demands the most from the audience, to soften the specifics, to reach for abstraction, to give people enough distance from the reality that they can absorb it without being fully inside it. This story will not do that. These were real children in a real house on a real night, and the full account of what happened to them is the minimum that their memory is owed. When a fire burns in an enclosed space with an accelerant present, it consumes oxygen at a rate that the natural ventilation of a standard council terrace cannot replenish. The oxygen level in a room drops before the temperature becomes unsurvivable. What this means in practice is that smoke, carbon monoxide, and the other products of rapid combustion reaches a person before the flames do. It enters the respiratory system. It moves through the body quickly. A sleeping child in a room filled with this kind of smoke does not wake to clarity. They wake, if they wake at all, to confusion, to a world that has already been chemically altered against them, to an atmosphere that is compromising their cognitive function at the same moment they are trying to use it. The disorientation is not incidental. It is the mechanism. The body is being shut down before the mind has registered that shutdown has begun. Jade was 10. She was the eldest, and in the structure of that household she had always carried an awareness that the younger children had not yet developed. If she woke with enough cognitive clarity to understand what was happening around her, she may have tried to reach her brothers. The question of what she understood and what she was able to do with that understanding in the minutes available to her is one that cannot be answered, and the impossibility of answering it is its own kind of unbearable. Duane was 8, old enough to understand fire, old enough, under normal circumstances, to move quickly and find a way to a door or a window. The circumstances inside that house in those minutes were not normal by any definition that matters. John was 7. He was the child who found corners, who occupied space quietly, who did not demand the room's attention. Whatever corner John found on the night of the 10th of May was not one with a way out. Jack was 6. He had spent every day of his short life in motion, pulling apart everything he could reach, climbing everything that could be climbed, existing at full physical pitch in the way that only a 6-year-old boy entirely comfortable with his own body can exist. The fire did not care what Jack was capable of on any other day. Jesse and Jaden were 5. They were each other's fixed point in every situation they had ever encountered. The closed loop of two people who had shared every moment of their existence from before either of them could form a conscious thought about sharing. Whatever happened in those final minutes, they were together. That is the one fact in this part of the story that does not need to be qualified or complicated. The exits were not available. The ground floor, the main door, the route through the front of the house, the natural path of escape, had been taken by the fire. The petrol had been concentrated there. The blaze had started there and had established itself there before anyone on the upper floors or in the garage had any awareness that they needed to move. By the time movement was possible, the movement that was possible did not lead to safety. The windows in the upper rooms were the kind found throughout Council Terrace housing of that construction era. Not large, not designed as emergency exits, not openable to a width that a child could use as an escape route without assistance from an adult who was not present to provide it. The converted garage was a sealed problem. Its window was small. Its primary exit was compromised. The wall between the garage and the rest of the structure was the same thin construction that had allowed the family's noise to reach their neighbors on any given night, and it offered no resistance whatsoever to what was moving through the building. The fire service arrived at Victory Road with equipment and training, and the fundamental urgency of people who have committed their professional lives to the proposition that they will go into the places others cannot. They came as fast as the call and the distance allowed. They arrived to a house producing heat and smoke at a rate that told experienced firefighters, immediately and without room for misreading, exactly what they were confronted with. They could not enter. The fire had moved through the lower structure with enough speed and thoroughness that entry through the ground floor was not survivable for the people who would have been attempting it. The firefighters were placed in the position that training can prepare a person for intellectually, but cannot prepare them for in any way that matters when they are standing in front of it. Outside a burning building, knowing that children are inside, and being physically unable to reach them, they stood on Victory Road, and they did what the fire and the physics and the structure of the house forced them to do. They managed what could be managed from the exterior. They waited for an opening that did not come in time. When the fire was brought under control, and the firefighters were able to move through the remains of the structure, they found Jade, they found Wayne, they found John, they found Jack, they found Jesse, they found Jaden. 6 children in one house on one night. The firefighters who stood on Victory Road in the early hours of the 11th of May did not leave that night behind them when the shift ended. They carried it into the days and weeks and years that followed, in the way that certain events attach to the interior of a person and do not release with time or distance. In the years after the fire, it was reported that some of the first responders still could not speak about that night without their composure breaking entirely, not because they were fragile, because they had stood outside a house and been unable to stop what was happening inside it. And there is no professional framework and no passage of time that resolves that particular weight into something bearable. Someone had put those children there. Someone had taken away their exits. Someone had made that night what it was. That word, someone, would not rest until a name was attached to it. When Mick Philpott arrived at the scene of the fire, he performed that word requires defense, because it is a serious thing to say about a man standing in front of a burning house in the early hours of the morning, regardless of what the evidence would later establish. The defense of it is this: the evidence established it. The investigators who observed Mick's behavior in the immediate aftermath, and who subsequently reviewed the footage recorded at the scene and in the media appearances that followed over the days ahead, reached a conclusion that was consistent across every professional who examined it. What they were watching was not grief. It carried the shape of grief. It produced the sounds associated with grief, but it had the quality of a man who had prepared for this moment rather than a man to whom this moment had just happened without warning. Mick was loud at the scene. He was physically demonstrative in a way that drew and held the attention of everyone present. The firefighters still managing the site, the emergency responders processing the initial reports, the neighbors who had come out of their houses to stand on the street and look at a building they had seen every day of their lives, now reduced to a shell of smoke and char. He moved through the space with the energy of a man generating a presence, and in generating that presence, he ensured that the eyes of everyone around him were on him, tracking him, responding to him, rather than resting on anything else. He raised Lisa Willis's name at the scene. He did not wait to be asked. He did not introduce the subject as a reluctant suspicion, the way a genuinely confused and devastated person might raise a half-formed thought. He named her directly, and with the force of prepared conviction, standing in front of police officers who were still in the opening minutes of their response, in front of neighbors who had just been told that 6 children were dead, in front of the cameras that had arrived at the scene with the speed that cameras always achieve when a story of this scale is breaking. He named her, and he did not stop naming her. The message was consistent. This was connected to Lisa Willis, her interference, her campaign against this family, and the detectives should be looking at her. Myred moved alongside him in a quieter register, as she had always moved alongside him. She was visibly distressed in the way that a person who has just lost 6 children could credibly be expected to appear, hollowed and barely functional, leaving the public voice of the couple's grief to Mick while she occupied the space behind him. Whether what she was experiencing in those hours constituted genuine anguish or something more complicated is a question that the jury at Nottingham Crown Court would spend considerable time with. The media received the couple as the media. In the immediate aftermath of a disaster of this scale, almost always receives the people at the center of it, with the default assumption that the most visibly distressed parties are the most legitimately devastated ones. The coverage in the hours and days after the fire presented Mick and Myred as parents destroyed by a catastrophic accident, and the framing of Lisa Willis as a complicating presence, whose history with the family was somehow relevant to what had happened, was not immediately challenged. Challenging the grief narrative of parents who have just lost 6 children requires a level of certainty that journalism responsibly does not claim before evidence is in. The coverage waited for the investigation to produce that certainty. Now stop here for a moment. Think about whether you have ever been in the presence of a person who was visibly distressed, crying, moving, producing every external indicator of genuine emotional experience, and felt, despite all of it, that something was not right. Not a vague discomfort, but a specific located sense that the emotion being displayed and the emotion being felt were different things existing in the same body. It is one of the most disorienting experiences available to a human being, because it requires trusting your own perception over the evidence directly in front of you. And most people have been reasonably trained to extend the benefit of the doubt to people in visible pain. Have you ever set that perception aside? Have you ever decided you were probably imagining it because the alternative was too uncomfortable to hold on to? Now ask yourself, what would it have taken to speak up? Because the detectives working this case were approaching exactly that question from the direction of evidence rather than instinct, and the evidence was beginning to produce answers that instinct alone could never have generated. The disconnect between what Mick and Myred were presenting on camera and what the physical evidence inside the burned structure was already indicating was present from the first hours of the investigation, even before the forensic results confirmed it. The fire had not behaved the way accidental fires behave. The distribution of damage did not fit the profile of a domestic accident. The locations of maximum burn intensity corresponded too precisely to the places where the children had been sleeping for that correspondence to be the product of chance. These were not conclusions that took weeks to reach. They were conclusions that the physical reality of the scene was already offered to anyone with the training to read it. Mick Philpott stood in front of cameras, describing his grief and directing the narrative toward Lisa Willis. 20 meters away, inside what remained of his house, the evidence was building a different story without any assistance from anyone. 2 accounts. One of them was built from performance. One of them was built from physics. Only one of them was going to last. Forensic investigation does not begin with a conclusion. It begins with what is physically present, how it is distributed, what sequence of events it indicates, and what that sequence excludes as possibility. The forensic team that processed the fire scene at number 18 Victory Road was not working toward a predetermined answer. They were working through the evidence. The evidence, once worked through, left very little room. The presence of petrol residue at the scene was confirmed through laboratory analysis of samples collected from the debris in the days following the fire. The residue was not distributed in the pattern that an accidental introduction of a flammable substance produces. An accidental fire, a fuel source that was improperly stored, a spill that reached a heat source, the kind of domestic tragedy that investigation teams encounter and, after full examination, classify as. Precisely that does not concentrate accelerant at multiple specific points across a ground floor. It does not deposit that accelerant in the locations most likely to prevent the occupants of a building from reaching their exits. The pattern found at Victory Road was not consistent with the accident. It was consistent with placement. The burn patterns confirmed the forensic analysis. Investigators mapped the damage across the structure of the house, with the methodical precision that this kind of work required, producing a reconstruction of how the fire had moved from ignition to the state in which the first responders had found it. That reconstruction pointed consistently to the ground floor, to the points of accelerant concentration, to a sequence of events that required a person making deliberate decisions rather than an incidental domestic failure to explain. These findings changed the character of the investigation, not with drama or announcement. That is not how investigative processes shift. They shift the way a balance shifts, incrementally, as each new piece of evidence adds its weight to one side of the assessment rather than the other. The detectives working the case moved from the necessarily open position that the cause was undetermined into the territory of a confirmed deliberate fire, and from there into the question of who had set it and why. And the question of who had set it was one for which the evidence was already supplying a direction. The witnesses were essential to what followed. In the days and weeks after the fire, people who had sat in rooms with Mick Philpott and heard him describe, with the casual confidence of a man entertaining, a hypothesis rather than communicating a plan, the outline of exactly what had happened to his house and his children. Those people began to contact police. They came forward individually, without coordination, and with a quality of discomfort in their accounts that suggested they had been sitting with the weight of what they knew from the moment the news of the fire had reached them. They had heard him talk about starting a fire. They had heard him talk about making it appear to be an accident. They had heard him talk about directing suspicion toward Lisa Willis. They had filed every one of those conversations under dark humor and moved on. And now they were sitting in front of detectives explaining why they had made that filing decision, and what they understood, in retrospect, that decision had cost. The accounts were consistent. They corroborated one another across the details that mattered. What Mick had said, the context in which he had said it, the tone he had used, the way the people around him had received it and dismissed it. Taken individually, each account was significant. Taken together, they were the verbal architecture of a plan that the physical evidence had already confirmed had been carried out. Mick and Narrated's account of their own movements on the night of the 10th of May was examined against this accumulated evidence and found to be insufficient. The timeline contained gaps. The explanation for their absence from the house at the time the fire started did not carry the texture of genuine recollection. It carried the texture of a version constructed in advance of being required to produce one. The attempt to direct attention toward Lisa Willis, which in the immediate aftermath of the fire had been absorbed into the grief narrative the couple were projecting, looked different once the forensic results and the witness testimony were placed beside it. It looked like the component of a plan that had been rehearsed and deployed, and that was now being tested against a body of evidence. It had not been designed to survive. The couple's account fractured under the sustained pressure of detailed questioning, not catastrophically, not in a single moment of visible collapse, but in the accumulated way that accounts built around a constructed narrative, rather than an actual memory, tend to fracture. At the edges first, then progressively, until the center cannot hold the shape around it. There was a moment, described in the reporting that surrounded the subsequent trial, when a detective reviewing the full body of forensic evidence against the background of the witness accounts and the timeline discrepancies sat with the complete picture of what the investigation had produced and had to stop, had to leave the room, not because the evidence was complicated or ambiguous, because it was clear, because it answered with the specific and final certainty that only physical evidence can produce. The question of what had been done to 6 children in a house on Victory Road on the night of the 10th of May. The investigation had arrived at its conclusion. What remained was the courtroom, the jury, and the 8 weeks of evidence that would be required to carry that conclusion to the weight of law. That courtroom was in Nottingham, and it was waiting. Nottingham Crown Court received this case in early 2013, And for 8 weeks it held the country's attention with the specific, sustained gravity that only a trial of this nature can generate. The gallery filled each morning with journalists, legal observers, and members of the public who understood, before a single witness had been called, that what was taking place inside that building was not simply the prosecution of 3 individuals. It was accounting, an 8-week, publicly conducted examination of how 6 children came to die in their beds on a street in Derby, and of whether the law had the tools and the evidence to name the people responsible for it with the precision that the weight of the charge demanded. 3 people occupied the dock: Mick Philpott, Mick Philpott, and Paul Mosley, a friend and associate of Mick's, a man drawn into the orbit of the plan that Mick had constructed, and who now sat alongside the couple facing the same charge as the people beside him. All 3 were charged with the manslaughter of 6 children: Jade, Duane, John, Jack, Jesse, and Jaden. The charge was manslaughter rather than murder, because the prosecution's position rested on a specific argument about intent. The fire, in the prosecution's account, had not been set with the deaths of the children as its primary objective. It had been set as a staged emergency, one that Mick and Myred intended to interrupt, presenting themselves as parents who had arrived in time to rescue their children, and in doing so, positioning Lisa Willis as the person whose sustained interference with their family had provoked the catastrophic event. The fire had exceeded every parameter its creators had assigned to it. The children had died, not because their deaths were the intended outcome, but because the plan that caused them failed to account for the speed of the blaze and the structural inadequacy of a building never designed to contain one. The law named this manslaughter. The families of the dead and the people who worked the case named it something that sits beyond the reach of legal classification. The prosecution built its case across 4 interconnected strands, each one capable of carrying significant weight independently, and collectively constituting an argument that the jury would spend 8 weeks absorbing with the attention it required. The forensic evidence led the specialist who testified about the petrol residue found throughout the ground floor of the Victory Roadhouse, and about the burn patterns that the fire had produced, delivered testimony that produced the particular quality of silence that falls over a room when something irrefutable is being stated in public for the first time. The residue was present in concentrations at specific locations. Those locations corresponded to where the children had been sleeping. The burn patterns were consistent with a fire that had been deliberately accelerated at points chosen to maximize its spread and minimize the likelihood of escape. No alternative explanation was offered by the forensic data. The science said what it said, and it said it without ambiguity. The witness testimony followed and gave the forensic evidence its human architecture. One after another, people who had heard Mick Philpott describe the outline of what had been carried out in casual settings, at ordinary volume, in the social company of people who had chosen to file it under dark humor, came before the court and repeated what they had heard. Their discomfort was visible and consistent. These were not people who had come to court with scores to settle. They were people carrying the specific, corrosive weight of knowing that they had heard something they should have reported and had not, and that the thing they had not reported had produced 6 funerals on a street they all recognized. One account was definitive. A witness described sitting with Mick as he talked about fire, about accidents, about the way a scene could be managed and a narrative directed. They described his manner as he spoke, relaxed, engaged, entertained by his own hypothesis in the way that a person is entertained by something they have spent real time thinking through and found themselves satisfied with. They described him laughing, not nervously, not with any quality that could be charitably interpreted as discomfort at the subject matter, with the ease of a man who found what he was saying genuinely amusing. When this witness completed their account and directed their gaze at the jury, the room absorbed that moment in a silence that no one who was present subsequently struggled to describe. The jury looked back, and the exchange between them carried a weight that no legal observer in the gallery that day failed to register. The prosecution completed its picture with a financial motive: the overcrowded house, the documented council assessment, the failed housing application, the cold calculation that a disaster would generate what years of legitimate process had not, and with the custody dispute with Lisa Willis woven into the financial strand as the second pillar of a motive that was inseparable from the first. The defense responded with what the evidence left available. It challenged the forensic interpretation, arguing that accelerant traces could have explanations rooted in legitimate domestic use rather than deliberate placement. It pressed on the absence of a direct confession. It argued that a jury being asked to reach conclusions about intent from circumstantial evidence, however consistent and however substantial, was being asked to do something that the standard of reasonable doubt was specifically designed to prevent. These were serious arguments. They were the arguments of a competent defense team working a case where every strand of physical evidence, every piece of testimony, and every aspect of the couple's documented behavior pointed in one direction without exception. The jury sat with the full weight of 8 weeks of truth and retired to deliberate. The 2nd of April, 2013, is the date that Nottingham Crown Court delivered its answer. Mick Philpott, guilty of manslaughter. Narrated Philpott, guilty of manslaughter. Paul Mosley, guilty of manslaughter. The words entered the room and did what verdicts do when they confirm something that evidence has spent months constructing toward. They did not surprise the people who had been closest to the investigation, and they did not reduce, even by a fraction, the weight of what they named. Guilty is a legal word. It performs a legal function. What it cannot do, and was never designed to do, is carry the full measure of what those 3 people had done to 6 children on a street in Derby on a night in May. The verdict named the crime. The crime itself remained beyond the reach of any word the English language contains. The sentencing that followed placed each of the 3 defendants in the position that the law determines appropriate for the act they committed. Mick Philpott was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 15 years to be served before he would be eligible for consideration for release. Narrated Philpott received 17 years. Paul Mosley received 23 years. The sentences were read into the record of Nottingham Crown Court, and the dock that had held 3 people through 8 weeks of proceedings was now the space from which 3 convicted individuals were taken down. Inside the courtroom, the reaction moved through the room not as a single wave, but as a series of separate, deeply private responses happening simultaneously in the same space. Some people in the gallery were still, not with the stillness of composure, but with the stillness of people absorbing something too large to produce an immediate outward response. Others wept with the directness of people who had been holding the weight of this case for almost a year, and had reached the point at which the verdict gave them somewhere to put it. Legal professionals who had processed their professional involvement with the practiced restraint of people accustomed to courtrooms found the restraint harder to maintain than it usually was. Outside the court building, the crowd that had gathered on the street received the news through the phones and the people moving in and out of the entrance, and the reaction there was different in character from the one inside. Louder, less contained, carrying the particular emotion of a community that had watched this case from the outside, had watched 6 small coffins move through their city in the summer of the previous year, and had been waiting since that day for the law to produce the conclusion they needed it to produce. The detectives who had worked the case were not all present in the same place when the verdict was delivered. Some were in the court. Some had already left the building. Some received it in offices, in corridors, in cars. The thing they shared, regardless of where they were when the words were read, was a response that seasoned investigators who had spent careers processing violence and its aftermath were not fully prepared for. Some of them wept directly, without apology, in the way that people weep when something they have been carrying finally finds its resolution. Not because the resolution repairs anything, because it does not, but because it confirms that the weight they had been carrying was real, and that the system they had trusted to carry it with them had done its job. The firefighters who had stood on Victory Road in the early hours of the 11th of May 2012 and been unable to enter a burning house received the verdict the same way. They had not stopped seeing that night. They had not found a way to process it into something manageable. The verdict did not give them that, because a verdict in a courtroom 13 months after the fact cannot give a person back the night they stood on a street and watched. But it confirmed that what they had done, showing up, pushing as far as the fire and the physics allowed, carrying the weight of what they could not change, had been part of a chain that led to this moment. That was something, even if it was not enough. I want to stop here and speak directly to everyone who has stayed with this story. If you are sitting with something right now, if the weight of what you have just heard is sitting in your chest, and you do not quite know what to do with it, leave a comment below. Not because this channel asks for engagement as a transaction, but because Jade, Duane, John, Jack, Jesse, and Jaden deserve to have the space they occupy in your thoughts acknowledged out loud. Share this video with someone who needs to understand what this case means. Not for the algorithm or them. A verdict closes a legal process. It does not close anything else. The community of Derby that had lived with this case from the morning the news broke, that had watched the coverage, read the headlines, absorbed the grief narrative, and then the revelation, and then the correction of the narrative, did not return to ordinary life the day the jury delivered its verdict. Communities do not move through events of this scale and emerge unchanged on the other side. Victory Road was changed. Allenton was changed. The city carried the case the way cities carry the particular weight of violence that originates from within a family, which is the hardest kind to metabolize because it occurs in the spaces that the city cannot see. Savannah and Leanne had not been in the house on Victory Road on the night of the 10th of May. They had lived away from the household, in arrangements that placed them outside the immediate physical geography of that night. This fact, the fact that they were alive, does not represent a clean form of survival. They had lost 6 siblings to a fire that their father had set. They had lost a mother who had been convicted of their siblings' manslaughter. They had lost, in the most comprehensive sense available, the structure that, whatever its dysfunction and its violence, had been the family they grew up alongside. The loss that Savannah and Leanne carried out of this case was not the kind that has a language adequate to it. It was the loss of everything that a person means when they say family, including the version of it that had always been unstable and harmful, because the destruction of even a harmful thing by the people who were supposed to protect you carries a specific and lasting damage. The firefighters and emergency responders who had been first on the scene at Victory Road on the 11th of May did not recover from that night in the way that recovery is popularly described. They returned to their shifts. They responded to subsequent calls, subsequent fires, subsequent emergencies that required everything their training had equipped them to provide. But the night of the Victory Road fire occupied a space inside each of them that ongoing professional life did not displace. In the reporting that surrounded the case, first responders described the specific, non-negotiable nature of what they had carried out of that night. Not grief in the abstract, but the particular precision of a memory that stays exact long after most memories have softened. The sounds, the heat, the moment of understanding what was inside the building and the moment of understanding what the building was doing to what was inside it. Years after the verdict, some of them still could not speak about it without stopping. The institutional examination that followed the trial was among the most important consequences the case produced, and among the least discussed publicly relative to its significance. Social services, schools and police, had all had contact with the Philpott household in the years leading up to the fire. Contact had been made, reports had been filed, assessments had been conducted, and the household had been visited by people with a professional mandate to identify children in need of protection. None of those visits had produced a sustained, decisive intervention that altered the trajectory of what was building inside that house. The post-trial analysis looked at why, and the answers it produced were not comfortable for any of the institutions involved. The picture that emerged was one of a system that had encountered Mick Philpott at multiple points, and had at multiple points been managed by him rather than the other way around. His ability to present an acceptable surface to official scrutiny, to produce the language of cooperation, to embody, when required, the profile of a difficult but ultimately engaged parent, had repeatedly served to reduce the urgency of the interventions being contemplated. The concerns that Lisa Willis had raised through her formal complaints had been received and recorded, but the institutional response had not escalated at the rate that the evidence, in retrospect, warranted. Following the trial, changes to how domestic abuse and child welfare cases are handled in the United Kingdom were examined, and in several areas reformed. The threshold for sustained intervention was reviewed. The weight given to the testimony of former partners raising welfare concerns was reconsidered. The Philpott case became, in the professional literature of child protection, a reference point for the cost of insufficient escalation. The media's initial framing of the case, the grieving father, the terrible accident, the family destroyed by circumstances, was corrected publicly and without reservation once the verdict was delivered. Outlets that had carried Mick Philpott's performance of grief with the default credibility they extend to bereaved parents re-examined their coverage and found in it the evidence of how effectively he had managed the narrative in the hours and days following the fire. That re-examination was not comfortable for the journalists involved, but it produced something useful, a more conscious and more scrutinized approach to the coverage of parental grief in cases where an investigation is still open and the cause of a child's death has not been legally determined. In this way, too, the 6 children of Victory Road left something behind that extended beyond the specific coordinates of their loss. The world that existed after the verdict was not repaired by it, but it was not entirely unchanged by it either. That distinction matters. This story does not end in a courtroom. It does not end with a sentence, with a prison door, or with the specific date on which Mick Philpott, or Myra Philpott, or Paul Mosley will or will not be considered for release. It ends, to the extent that it ends at all, in the space between reading about something like this and deciding what to do with what you now know. So let us talk about what this case actually reveals, because there are lessons buried in the architecture of the Philpott household that extend far beyond Derby and far beyond 2012, and they deserve to be named with the directness that 6 children's deaths demand they be named with. Domestic control does not arrive as a declaration. It does not announce itself with language that anyone who cares about the person inside it can immediately identify and respond to. It arrives as the gradual removal of alternatives. It arrives as financial dependence deepens slowly enough that the person inside it does not register a single decisive moment of loss, only the accumulating reality that the exits they might have used have been quietly closed off, one by one, over a period of years. Myra Philpott did not wake up one morning inside a controlled household. She arrived there through a process that used the ordinary vocabulary of a relationship. Shared children, shared finances, shared domestic life, and used it to construct walls rather than a home. The children who live inside households built on this architecture do not always understand that what surrounds them is not normal. Normal for a child is the specific texture of the life they are actually living. Jade understood more than a 10-year-old should have needed to understand about the mood of a room and the risk of the wrong conversation. Duane had the laugh of a child who found relief in noise. John had learned to find his corner. Jack spent his energy in the physical way of a child whose emotional environment does not offer him enough safe places to direct it. Jesse and Jaden had each other, which was everything they had found reliable in a world that was not as stable as it should have been, and they held onto it with both hands. These are not unusual children. They are the children who exist in households like this one in every city in every country. Right now, tonight, in houses on streets that look exactly like Victory, rode from the outside, and are carrying something entirely different from what the outside suggests. The question that this story leaves us with is not whether those households exist. They do. The question is whether the people around them, neighbors who hear raised voices, teachers who notice that a child cannot settle, friends who hear something that should be reported but is not, are willing to bear the discomfort of acting on what they know rather than the comfort of deciding they probably imagined it. There are specific things that the Philpott case shows us about what control looks like when it has been operating long enough to feel normal to everyone inside it. A partner who does not work outside the home and has not for years. A social world that has contracted to the point where one person's version of events is the only version the household produces. Children who are discussed by their parents in terms of what they provide rather than who they are. A former partner whose concerns are described as malicious rather than engaged with as concerns. An escalating pattern of complaints to institutions that are being managed rather than responded to. These are not diagnostic criteria to be applied mechanically. They are patterns that people who know families like this, who live beside them, teach their children, occasionally sit across a table from them in official settings, are positioned to recognize and have a responsibility to take seriously. The warning signs in this case were not invisible. They were present. They were heard and seen and recorded by multiple people across multiple institutions across multiple years. They were not acted on with the urgency they demanded. The children paid the cost of that failure, and they paid it completely. Now we return to where this story began. Jade was 10 years old. She was sharp-minded and quietly observant, a girl who was moving toward a version of herself that the world never got to meet. Duane was 8 years old. He was energy and competition and a laugh that was too large for his frame. A boy who would have filled every room he ever entered. John was 7 years old. He was the one who found corners, who occupied space with a quiet and patient confidence that, given time, would have become something remarkable. Jack was 6 years old. He was motion and curiosity, and the particular fearlessness of a child who has not yet learned to be cautious of the world, and the world would have been better for having him in it longer. Jesse was 5 years old. He moved first and checked afterward, and he would have kept moving in that direction. Bold, forward, unafraid, for as long as life gave him a road to move along. Jaden was 5 years old. He knew that wherever he was going, someone who understood him completely was just behind him, and he faced the world with the confidence that knowledge produces. 6 children, 1 house, 1 decision made by the adults who were supposed to protect them. If this story has settled inside you in the way that it should, if you are carrying something right now that you did not carry at the beginning of this video, then carry it forward. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel so that the next story reaches you. Like this video so that it reaches someone else. And in the comments below, leave the name of someone you love. Because the best thing that stories like this one can ever produce is the decision to hold the people we have a little closer than we did before. Jade, Duane, Jack, Jesse, Jade. They deserved better. We can do better. That is not a conclusion. That is a beginning. Hello, my friends. Thank you for tuning in to another mysterious case on the Bedtime Black Files. This is where life's most powerful lessons are revealed through unforgettable true crime events from around the world. If you're stepping into our community for the first time, I'm truly glad you're here. Thank you for joining us. Before we get into it, Tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Consider hitting the subscribe button. Don't forget to like and share this video with someone who needs it. Your support helps our family grow, connect, and keep these powerful stories alive. Have a cozy sleep. See you on the next one.